And thank you for inviting me to give this talk to you today. So my name is Anusha Vable. I'm associate professor here at UCSF in the Department of Family and Community Medicine. And my research agenda focuses on identifying and advocating for structural solutions to health inequities. For those of you who are new to grant writing, this might be totally new information. And for seasoned grant writers, I hope that this will also have, I believe that this talk will also have something to offer. For example, I have very strong preferences about formatting, which are different than I've seen in the typical proposals. A little bit of housekeeping. I want to disclose that I received financial support from NIH, and NIH had no influence on the content of this talk or my decision to give the talk. Okay, I also wanted to humanize myself a little bit. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a Midwesterner. I'm from Michigan. I'm a Yooper, which is what we call people from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So I grew up here in this little town called Houghton. And this is a picture from one of my favorite hikes. I hike a lot. It's one of the ways that I maintain my mental health, and I come up with most of my best ideas when I'm walking around outside. I have a family. So my husband is an elementary school principal, and we have a daughter, Leela, who's 3.5, and she is a tiny joy. And something that might not be clear from my CV is just how often I've failed or been rejected. I just want to point out that I'm objectively successful, and I'm associate professor at a soft money institution, which means I have to have multiple grants simultaneously, which I do. I have 3 R01 equivalent grants as PI or MPI, which is why I was invited to give this talk. Okay, so here are a few examples of the times that I've failed. My first author paper was rejected 7 times. I didn't get into any doctoral programs the first time I applied. I failed a section of the qualifying exam and had to retake it. My loan repayment program application was rejected 3 times before I got it. And I applied twice and never got a K award, which means I entered postdoc purgatory. And I don't tell you all this to say that my career trajectory is typical, but what is typical is that you get rejected a lot in this career path. And so I want to acknowledge it, and that it can be scary because sometimes the stakes are really high. And even those of us who are quite successful have experienced a lot of rejection. So this is an overview of my talk today. First, I'm going to define structural racism so that we're all on the same page about the enormity of the challenge ahead. Then I'm going to review the NIH grant writing process. Then I'm going to tell you my 3 tips, which are strategy, salesmanship, and formatting. And then I'm also going to talk about how I recommend you make time for grant writing. So I give this talk as an equity scholar and as someone who believes that NIH is biased against the kind of work I do. I think the evidence is really convincing that NIH is biased against population health research. We know this because they tell us this explicitly. So this is a paper from NIH by Hopp and colleagues in 2019. And so this is what they say. I'm just going to read this highlighted section. Notably, African-American and Black applicants tend to propose research on topics with lower award rates. These topics include research at the community and population level, as opposed to more fundamental and mechanistic investigations. The latter tend to have higher award rates. I also, the type of work I do is population level equity research. So this statement also applies to me. And while I don't, I want to say that part of doing good research is asking good questions, which is what they did here. They ask who is getting funded, who wasn't getting funded, and why certain people weren't getting funded. And while I don't love the framing of this paper, they're still blaming the victim for not getting funded rather than the institution for not supporting important work in certain areas. I think it's laudable that NIH did this analysis and wrote this paper. The knowledge and being self-reflective is the first step, and I believe that NIH is changing, just slowly. Another example is that I need to do a bunch of trainings the last time I was on study section, and I thought they were quite good. In these trainings, they named the areas with the largest social sources of bias, which are the investigators and the institutions, and they created trainings to reduce bias in these areas specifically. So again, I believe that NIH is self-reflective and they are changing, just slowly. All right, so as I said, I'm an equity scholar, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page about the enormity of the challenge ahead. You'll notice that the slide quality is slightly elevated for the next few slides. These slides are part of a project that I'm working on with a graphic designer to make structural racism more accessible. And the plan is to eventually put these slides up for free download so all of you can incorporate them into your own lectures. So for those of you who haven't read it yet, I highly recommend this paper by Bailey and colleagues that came out in The Lancet in 2017. In the abstract, they define structural racism. They say structural racism refers to the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, employment, earnings, benefits, credit, media, healthcare, and criminal justice. These patterns and practices in turn reinforce discriminatory beliefs, value, and the distribution of resources. And the emphasis on mutually reinforcing is mine. So this is the quotation I just read depicted graphically, right? There's the mutually reinforcing systems of housing, education, etc. And so there's racism within each system or institution, and that is systemic racism. But there are also arrows between the systems so that they're mutually reinforcing, and that's what makes it structural. So let's follow some of these arrows and see where it leads us. First, we know that redlining meant Black folks were not able to buy houses in certain areas. So that is historical racialized housing discrimination. But there's also contemporary housing discrimination. There are two kinds of housing assistance in the US, one that helps homeowners, which are predominantly white people, and one that helps renters, which are predominantly people of color or Black people. And there is more federal money for homeowners than there is for renters. The Center on Budget and Policy Analysis estimates that 23.4 million renters pay more than 50% of their income in housing, and most don't receive rental assistance due to funding limitations. I have never heard of homeowners not getting a financial benefit for being homeowners. And so this is how you can oppress people of color without mentioning race. You can say, oh, we're just going to dramatically underfund the housing assistance that people of color depend on, right? So this doesn't just hurt Black people, it hurts all people struggling to pay for housing. And this is broadly true of structural racism. It's race neutral, so everyone is harmed by the system, regardless of your race. Okay, so we're at housing, and we see how there's systemic racism within the housing system. In this country, we fund our schools through our local property taxes. So we create a link between the value of your home and the quality of your public education options. So it's through this arrow that we can use the systemic racism within the housing system to ensure unequal and racialized opportunities within the education system. But there's also systemic racism within the education system. For example, schools have used exclusionary discipline to push out students more likely to bring down standardized test scores. And our team has work in progress showing that this exclusionary discipline is associated with lower educational attainment trajectories. We also know that Black men without a high school diploma are much more likely to be incarcerated than other Black men or white men with or without a high school diploma. So this data came from the Pew Research Center, and it's from 2014. And so on the x-axis, you can see time from 1960 to 2010. And this dark purple is, and so this is the Black-white gap in incarceration rates by high school diploma. And so you can see that Black men without a high school diploma are orders of magnitude more likely to be incarcerated than Black men overall, or by white men with or without a high school diploma. And so how people are treated by police, impacts how they're perceived and how they're portrayed in the media. So this is Aisha Evans, who is non-violently protesting the police killing of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. And this individual killed 9 people during a Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I want you to note that in the top photo, this anti-racist and non-violent action was met with violence by police, while in the bottom photo, this overtly racist and violent action was met by non-violence by police. Only one person is acting in a way that's disruptive to the social structure of our nation, and she was met with violence. Okay, additionally, in this country, if you have criminal justice involvement, we've decided that we're really just going to punish you for the rest of your life. So people with criminal justice involvement have curtailed employment options. And in many states, we don't let people with felony convictions vote. I think the prevention of voting is really egregious. So we literally prevent people from having any say in the laws that dictate their lives. Okay, so that brings us to work. In this country, we care a lot about work. We're told to work hard and just pick ourselves up by the bootstraps and just keep working. There's a global pandemic, keep working. There's an insurrection at the Capitol, keep working. We're almost forced to make work a part of our identity, and we're taught that you should love your job and keep working and love what you do, even if you're exploited and burnt out. And we tie key benefits to work. So in this country, most people get their healthcare through their jobs. So the access to care and the quality of care are both often socially patterned by the type and prestige of employment. This is totally illogical and not good for health. I actually met someone yesterday who used to be a window washer at Salesforce, and I imagine keeping the windows at Salesforce clean is a perpetual challenge, and he got run over by a car. He was in the ICU at SFGH for 2 months. During those 2 months, he wasn't working, so he lost his job and he lost his health insurance. He had a lot of physical therapy in front of him, but he couldn't afford it without insurance. And he had more pressing issues to deal with, like not having a home. Being run over by a car should not upend your life in this way. It shouldn't result in you losing your job, losing your benefits, and losing your home. You shouldn't lose everything because you were run over by a car, which, by the way, is something that can happen to all of us. We need to change the system so that we stop tying our health insurance to work. And doctors, we need your help with this. We also tie safety net benefits to work. For example, the nation's largest poverty alleviation program is the Earned Income Tax Credit. It is the Earned Income Tax Credit. You don't get the benefit if you don't have an income. Additionally, in the debt ceiling negotiations this year, they tied SNAP benefits to work, highlighting that structural racism is not in the past, it is contemporary and ongoing. And of course, your employment affects your earnings and your credit. And your credit impacts your ability to get housing, which includes both owning and renting a home. So you can see how quickly we start at one system and we hit all the other systems. This is structural racism. It is omnipresent, it is active, and it is ongoing, and it undergirds our whole society. So this is what we are up against. And I will just say that once you start seeing this, you will start seeing it everywhere. Okay, there's a few things I want to point out about this. One is that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. The racial inequities that we observe do not occur in a vacuum. They are the result of the system that we've created. And because of the unnecessary interdependencies between these systems, we've set up a society that ensures that structural racism is omnipresent. Two, the system is pernicious because you only need to stumble once and then you're ricocheted into the system of pain. And all of us are at risk. We are all at risk of being run over by a car, right? All of us are at risk for crushing medical debt because the system is so opaque. And three, all of these arrows are choices, and we can make different choices. For example, we can choose not to pay for our schools with property taxes and break the arrow between education and housing. We can choose not to tie our health insurance to our jobs and break the arrow between employment and healthcare. And in fact, that is what we must do if we want to dismantle structural racism. I also want to point out that racism occurs on several levels. So it's structural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Structural racism we just defined. It's the system of mutually reinforcing structures and policies that results in the systemic oppression of poor people and people of color generally, but is especially successful in systemically oppressing Black people. Institutional racism occurs within institutions like hospitals, universities, businesses, and nonprofits. Interpersonal racism occurs between individuals, and you can think of this as intentional or unintentional, such as microaggressions. And internalized discrimination occurs when the social norms and expectations of society are reflected in an individual's view of themselves. For example, if someone thinks they aren't deserving of food, even when they're hungry. And I use this as an example because it comes from a colleague's work. This internalized discrimination is pernicious. It is not benign. And so too often in research and in society, we focus on the interpersonal racism at the expense of the monstrous structural racism that bolsters, scaffolds, and ensures that racism occurs on all other levels. Another thing I want to point out is that while these 4 levels of discrimination have been most well explicated for racism, it's actually true for many forms of discrimination. For example, the Dobbs decision made clear that gender discrimination is structural, and I can tell you from personal experience that it is deeply internalized. When you are shown that you are less during your formative years, it changes the way you view yourself, and it permeates every interaction that you have with the rest of the world. I still struggle with this, and I don't think it's something that will go away. Okay, I know that was a lot, so I'm going to pause for a few seconds before I move on. Okay, so let's talk about the NIH grant review process. So how does your grant get scored? So you submit your grant to NIH, and it gets assigned to 3 reviewers. And the reviewers can be people who know your work well but haven't published with you, or they could be people who've never heard of you, aren't familiar with the methods you use, and have not thought about the questions you ask. Ideally, and typically, these people, your reviewers are people with some expertise on your topic, but they could publish in a completely different literature than you. So your grant is scored on these 5 criteria: significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And in each of these sections, the reviewer lists the strengths and the weaknesses for each section, just like we get a Word document that has these sections, and you fill it in. And then we provide a score for each section and then an overall score for the whole application. And so the scores are lower numbers are better. So these are the scores. So 1 is exceptional. It's exceptionally strong with essentially no weaknesses. 2 is outstanding, negligible weaknesses. 3 is excellent. It's still very good. It's very strong, but with only minor weaknesses. And 4, maybe you have numerous minor weaknesses. And I wanted to just highlight, I believe most of my grants score a 3 or a 4. Which is still like a really good score. Okay, so this is what happens in the study section. For each grant that's discussed, the discussion goes as follows. First, the primary reviewer gives their preliminary score for the whole grant, and then reviewer 2 and reviewer 3. And then the primary reviewer introduces your application and goes over the 5 criterion and lists the score driving strengths and weaknesses, and gives their overall evaluation of the award, of the proposal. Then reviewers 2 and 3 add additional strengths and weaknesses, and they also give their overall evaluation. And then the whole panel discusses the application and asks questions. And we discuss areas of disagreement, and in this section, the scores may change. And then the chair gives a summary of the discussion. Reviewers 1, 2, and 3 give their final scores, and the rest of the panel scores within that range, although you can request a score outside the range. So everyone's score weighs equally, even those who haven't read your application at all, but the people who have read your application in depth provide kind of bookends for the scores. And so the reviewers' preliminary scores can vary a lot. I've seen R1 give a score of 5, which is like essentially unfundable, and then reviewer 2 gives a score of 1, which is essentially no weaknesses. And so then actually the discussion is really interesting, and the scores generally change. All right, so who serves on NIH study section? People who've been funded before are invited to serve on study section. And I think this helps explain why NIH is so slow to change. It's because the people whose ideas have already been funded decide which ideas get funded next. So given this reality, how can we successfully get NIH funding? So that brings us to strategy, which I think is the most important. So where should you submit your great idea? There's going to be some jargon, as there is whenever you discuss NIH, the National Institutes of Health. So I wanted to define that jargon to start. First, there's a couple different types of awards I'm going to be talking about. Ks are Career Development Awards. I should say, you'll see later that I'm very opposed to jargon, but if you are going to use jargon, please define it clearly. Okay, so the Ks help with the Career Development Award. The Ks are the Career Development Awards, and that helps people transition from a postdoc or junior faculty into an independent investigator. R awards are research awards, and they come in different levels. And then the RO1 is like an independent investigator award, and like that's the big that one has a lot of cachet. So you want to try. The goal is to eventually to get an RO1 at some point. And then there's also a number of institutes within the National Institutes of Health. And so they're either how it's pronounced or how it's spelled, the words we use depend on where the I is. So it can either be the National Institute of blah, 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 or it can be the National blah, blah, blah Institute. And so the ones that I'm going to be talking about the most, this is not a comprehensive list of the institutes, is Minority Health and Health Disparities, which I sometimes will refer to as the Equity Institute, and the National Institute of Aging, which is where I get all of my funding. And then there's also the National Institutes of Allergy Infectious Diseases, NIAID, NCI is the National Cancer Institute, and NHLBI is the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. Okay, so this is my impression of how NIH works. There's good equity research, and then there's what NIH will fund. And the area of overlap is actually quite small. But this is where you want to be. You want to be here doing research that you are excited about and that is fundable. I'm increasingly feeling like this overlap is predominantly within NIA, the National Institutes of Aging. But I hope I'm wrong. I hope that you can get it funded other places. All right, so you need to apply to institutions and foundations that are supportive of your research agenda and have money. Not all places are equally supportive of your ideas. So my K award, I never got a K. The same grant scored a 44 at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at NHLBI. And I reformatted the grant, which is basically unfundable. Then I reformatted the grant and submitted it to the American Heart Association, which scored in the top percentile, right? Same exact idea, unfundable at NHLBI, top percentile at AHA. So this can, like, figuring out which institute can be a challenge because NIH is arranged by outcomes and different institutes have different pay lines. And so you need to understand the pay lines. And so, as I mentioned, I identify and advocate for structural solutions to health inequities, focusing on diseases of aging. So there are 2 institutes that I could apply to. And the next few slides, I'll work to convince you that if you have other options, you should not apply to NIMHD if you want to do equity work. It's currently not strategic for me to apply to NIMHD, but it could be in the future. But pretty much the next few slides are where I bum everyone out. Here's NIMHD. It gave 692 awards in 2022. You can contrast that to NIA, where I apply, the Aging Institute, which had an order of magnitude, which gave an order of magnitude more awards. And you can compare that to NCI, which had the most awards, and they had almost double the number of awards of NIA. So the reason that, so why is it that NIMHD gives so much fewer awards? Well, they have much, much, much less funding. So this is the amount of NIH awards by institute in 2022 in billions. Oh, I should say that these data are all publicly available, and I will give you a QR code in a few minutes so that you can access these data yourself. So NIMHD's budget is $0.42 billion. You can contrast that with NIA, which has their budget is 7 times bigger. They have $3.5 billion. And then the most well-funded institute in 2022 was NIAID, which had almost $6 billion. And so this dramatically less funding for NIMHD is true in 2022, and it's also true historically. So this is NIH funding by institute from 2000 to 2022, and the funding is in billions, and we inflation adjusted the money. And so this hot pink line is NIMHD, or the Equity Institute, which was founded in 2000 as a center, and then in 2021, it was redesignated as an institute as part of the Affordable Care Act. And so this in the graphic is the Great Recession, and I'm not sure why, like all of the money went to NIA, but this is NIH's data. All right. And so even as funding for other institutes has increased dramatically, the funding for NIMHD has flatlined. So in orange, we have NIAID and NCI, which is Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and the National Cancer Institute. And you can see they're doing great. In the early 2000s, they got an influx of money, and they've been steadily increasing for almost a decade. Similarly, NHLBI, Heart, Lung, and Blood, and NIA have also seen steady increases in funding in the last few years, but not NIMHD. I think the comparison with NIAID, Allergy Infectious Diseases, is especially noteworthy because here they got a bump in funding with the pandemic, which is appropriate. But the pandemic is not the only thing that happened. There was also the murder of George Floyd, and there was no similar increase in funding for the institute that focuses on equity. Some people might argue that people should just do their research and just apply to a different institute, which is basically what I'm telling you to do. However, I don't think this is a good solution because everyone thinks they should be applying to NIMHD for equity work. So really, someone needs to tell you explicitly not to apply to NIMHD, which layers the nepotism on top of the underfunding. And also, even as I show people these slides, I find that people still apply to NIMHD because it just seems like it's the right institute, like it's the right fit for your work. And so I often end up talking to people again in 6 months when their grants aren't funded. The obvious solution is for NIMHD to be funded at a level that meets the challenge of the time. In my mind, structural racism is the most pressing and omnipresent threat to health and health equity. So NIMHD should be funded at the same levels as the most well-funded institutes, which is Allergy Infectious Diseases and the National Cancer Institute. So I'm actually working on a paper to make this argument because I think the data are pretty convincing. I also wonder what the data will look like once we incorporate the 2023 data, because just anecdotally from Twitter, I've seen a lot of notice of awards from NIMHD. So perhaps the changes that I'm advocating for are already starting to take place. So these are my scores on my first 3 R01 submissions, 39, 38, and 29. And the best possible score is 10. And all of these were funded at NIA, and they are likely unfundable at NIMHD. So where you apply really, really matters. You are at UCSF. Your immediate goal is to get funded. We need you to stay in the field. That means you need to get funded. Your first fewish projects are not the time to pursue your passion project. There's a grant that I've been wanting to write since 2019, and I haven't done it yet because it's not the strategic grant to write. And it's not the grant I'm working on now, and it's not the grant I'm going to be writing next year either. And so I just want to be very clear, like I think there's a belief in academia that you can study whatever you want, and that is not true. You can study what you can get funded. So this is a QR code to access the NIH funding data if you want to access it yourself and like play with it yourself. I will say that it's kind of a pain to use and that we ended up downloading it separately into CSV files for each year and then merging it to create the graphics you saw here. Okay, so that brings me to my next point, which is salesmanship. The significance is the most important part of your grant, and you don't just talk about it in the significance section. You need to motivate why anyone should care about your proposal, and you do it repeatedly throughout the grant. So you need to perpetually underscore significance. So throughout the grant, highlight why this research is important. I like to come up with a pithy phrase or idea and use it repeatedly. So this is an example from one of my grants, which is on food insecurity and dementia risk. So in the specific aims, we said there's almost no quantitative research evaluating the relationship between food insecurity and AD-ADRD. This is Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementias. In the significance section, we said that despite the shared risk factors for food insecurity and dementia, and empirical evidence strongly suggesting that food insecurity predicts cognitive functioning and cognitive decline, the relationship between food insecurity and dementia risk has not been evaluated. And then also in aim 1, we say, although no prior published analyses evaluate food insecurity and dementia risk, our preliminary results show blah, 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 blah. And so this is actually really important. If there is no research in your area on your research question, you need to include preliminary data. You need to convince NIH that if you're asking NIH to give you millions of dollars, you need to tell them that there's a signal there, right? Okay, So I said that you should come up with a pithy phrase or idea and use it repeatedly. So I showed you the specific significance and research approach. I showed you in the last slide places where I used them, but you could also use this same sentence in the project narrative, the project abstract, and in your bio sketches. You might think, isn't using the same phrase exactly bad writing advice? And I would say maybe, but you're writing a grant, not a novel. The goal is clarity with a grant, not beautiful prose. And also people learn through repetition. And also reviewers are tired. So it might be a relief to see the sentence that they recognize, to see a sentence that they recognize. Don't use jargons, acronyms, or convoluted language. Reviewers are tired. Use consistent terms. So for example, an acronyms, so like IVs, I often use IVs to mean instrumental variables, but it could also mean intravenous. And if you have a clinician researcher and you keep using the terms IVs, they might be confused about what you're talking about. The other thing is to use consistent terms. So I predominantly study education. And so these are just all the different terms we could use for education. And I think it's really important to use the same term because like, if I say education in one place and schooling in another place, people will be like, oh, this is a different word. Is it operationalized differently? Is it a different variable? Like it adds additional confusion by using inconsistent terms. I really recommend this 2-hour workshop by Michaela Kiernan, who's at Stanford. It's called 6 Techniques for Writing Concise Scientific Articles and Grants. 2 hours transformed my writing. I highly recommend this, and she can give it remotely. So you might ask your department or someone to help to bring Michaela to campus for you to have this workshop. I just really want to belabor this point. Acronyms degrade in understanding, and you really, really should avoid them. You want people to understand what you're doing in your grant, and if they have to keep remembering all these acronyms that are unfamiliar to them, it's a huge additional cognitive burden for the reviewers. You don't want to annoy the reviewers. You want them to be advocates for you. Another thing I recommend is putting confusing things in graphics. So this is a figure for one of my grants. This is my first time doing occupations research. It is very confusing. So this is the graphic we put in, and this is the text that we put underneath the graphic. And so you can, or like adjacent to the graphic. And so you can see it's super confusing. So, right, we say like, there's all these census codes. This is what we get from our population level data. And then the work demand data comes from 2 different sources. Before 2000, it comes from the DOT, and after 2000, it comes from the ONET. And there's different crosswalks for each of from the ONET to the census, from the DOT to the census, and from the ONET to the census, and there's different crosswalks over time. So we like wrote it out in text, but if we had just had the text and not have the graphic, I don't think our grant would have been fundable because this is just way too confusing, right? Okay, you know I hate acronyms, but sometimes they're unavoidable, like when you're doing occupations research. And so we made a table of all the acronyms and we made it colorful so the reviewers could find it easily. And we defined everything. So if you're going to use acronyms, just make it really obvious what they stand for. When you're grant writing, you're not just selling your ideas, you're also selling yourself, you're a team, and your collective ability to do the work you propose. And so you can really emphasize this both in the bio sketch and the justification and feasibility. I actually think the bio sketch is something I hadn't realized the importance of until I served on study section, because the bio sketch is actually the first thing the reviewers read in depth. They have a general sense of your proposal from the abstract, and then they read the bio sketches to see if you have the expertise on your team to successfully carry out the work that you propose to do. And so this is one of my bio sketches for the Food Insecurity and Dementia grant. And so this is a personal statement. And so I say what my long-term goal is. I say what I focus on and the awards I've gotten. And then I say I've previously published using the data sets, methods, and outcomes central to the proposed work. Then I talk about my collaborator, Susie Martinez, about her strengths, And then for these reasons, this MPI grant with Dr. Martinez, who has expertise in food insecurity, will be especially fruitful as you propose this innovative and novel line of inquiry. And then I close by saying, Dr. Martinez and I will co-lead these analyses with Dr. Maria Gleamore, who I've published with extensively. Our complementary expertise, previous publication records, strong working relationships, and joint commitment to social justice ensure the success of this project, right? So you're in the bio sketch, you're saying like, not only is the work innovative, but you and your team have the expertise to get it done. Something I also see a lot in study section is that people propose really innovative work, but they don't actually have the expertise on team to carry it out. So they either need to add another co-I, or the bio sketches need to be more strongly written to make sure that it's clear that they have all the expertise they need. Another place that you want to work on your salesmanship is the justification and feasibility section. And so in this section, what you try and emphasize is that the work is feasible by this team specifically. So in this justification, I wrote, our team has experience with the data sets, exposures, outcomes, and methodology to ensure the feasibility of these analyses. So you can see like this is almost the exact same sentence I wrote in my bio sketch, right? And then I talk about Susie Martinez, and I list a bunch of publications. I talk about myself and Dr. Gleamore, and I list a bunch of publications. And then I say that we have data on, and that we've published actually on this topics together and using this method in these data sets, right? And then this is the sentence I showed you before, like our preliminary results show that food insecurity is a strong predictor of dementia risk. They have tripled the dementia risk. And then I also say our strong preliminary findings demonstrate the feasibility of using HRS for this novel line of inquiry, while our complementary expertise and demonstrated collaborations ensure the success of this project. So when I wrote this, Susie and I, who's the other MPI in this grant, did not have a publication together. In fact, our first publication was accepted yesterday. So you still have, like, when you're writing a grant, you're just always writing from a position of strength. You're always saying like, this work is novel and we can do it. It's novel and we can do it. Okay. All right, formatting. Okay, this is something I have very strong feelings about. So this is a grant that I've I actually adapted one of my grants and I changed all the formatting. So in the specific aims, you just get hit with a wall of text. It's fully justified, right? And there's no spaces. Also, poor use of white space. All the white space is like at the top. It's not interspersed throughout the page. You have a graphic and it's kind of meh. And then there's three sections, the significance, that often I'll see that there's three sections. There's the significance, the innovation, and the approach. And then, okay, so this is what I have strong feelings about. Often the justification for all three aims is done in one section. So aims 1, 2, and 3. Similarly, the data for all aims is done in one section, 1, 2, 3. Same with the variables, same with the analysis, same with the alternative strategy. And so while this information is technically organized, I don't find this arrangement very logical, and it requires too much cognitive switching from the reviewer to be like, what aim are we talking about now, right? Like, what variables do we need? So in this example, which I've made ludicrously bad, the aims are never restated. But also the information from aim 1 is scattered throughout the document. So it's really hard for the reviewer because they keep needing to do this cognitive switching. Like, what are we even talking about when they're talking about like how you're operationalizing this variable? I think it's very frustrating as a reviewer, and you do not want to frustrate your reviewers because you want them to advocate for this work. This is a challenge. This is a challenge for the reviewer, and it's an even bigger challenge, I find, when you're on study section, because you're just perpetually scrolling and looking for information. So let me propose a better way. First, make it easy to navigate. Clearly delineate each aim. So I put like, this is aim 2. You can clearly find aim 2, and I put all the information for aim 2 in one spot. The other thing that I like to do within the aim is to have a structured methods approach and section. And so this is like the same thing I do with my papers. You talk about the sample, the exposure, the outcome, the effect modifiers, the confounders, and the analytic approach. And you really clearly signal where all of these sections are. Another thing I've seen that I find challenging is people will just say measures and list all the variables they're using and don't clearly delineate between the exposure, outcome, confounders, and effect modifiers. I don't like that. I like it to be crystal clear what's happening in each aim. Also, make it beautiful. So I recommend putting a graphic or table on each page. My first R01 went in with 19 figures and 2 tables. And I actually had a moment of panic like 2 days before it was due, and I posted on Twitter, like, is this too many figures? And this woman at University of Minnesota was like, do not stop until all the text is gone, which I thought was good and funny advice. If it's possible, I also like to include a DAG for each analysis, a directed acyclic graph. And I also try to pick a color scheme. It's not always possible because sometimes you take graphics from like the internet or from other people's papers. But I try to pick a color scheme for each grant, and that's just an easy way to help make the grant feel cohesive. So this is an example of one of my grants. And so you can see we really tried to intersperse white space throughout. We defined important terms. So I could have just done this in the text, but we're defining food insecurity here. And so that's really important. And so we made it pop. I think the first page is a really great place to include an inequities graphic, and I strongly recommend doing a graphic and don't just put it in the text. Like, figure out how you can cut words so that you have enough space for this graphic. Another thing is a conceptual model. That's another great way to break up text, and it shows that like you've really thought about your project. I try and use cheerful colors as much as possible. I clearly delineate aim 1. And then we also had a table with important points. And so we could have just included this in the text, but it wouldn't have popped. If it's something important, you want people to see it, put it in a graphic. All right, that brings me to my last point, which is make time for grant writing. This is what I used to do, and I would like to get back to doing it again. But what I recommend that you do is 3 months before the deadline, schedule 2 mornings a week for grant writing. So that's about, well, you don't have to do morning like I do morning, because morning is my best brain time. But just whenever you have your best brain time, schedule that time for grant writing. So, and I like to do about 6 hours per week. And then before the grant is due, 2 weeks before the grant is due, I try and cancel everything. I also meet with a grant writing group weekly or bi-weekly. So I recommend that you be self-reflective. When is your best brain time, and reserve your best brain time for you and the work that you think is really important, and try to resist just going into the email rabbit hole. It sometimes takes a few months to adjust your schedule, so start working on setting up your schedule to prioritize grant writing in advance. I also really recommend grant writing groups. So this is the operationalization of it. There's groups of 3 to 4 people. They meet for 1.5 to 2 hours per week. And so what we'll do in grant writing group is I'll be like, okay, I want feedback on my aim 2 approach. And so people will take 10 minutes and read aim 2 approach and then give feedback for 20 minutes. And then we set a timer, and then we'll just move on to the next person. So the next person might be like, I want feedback on my significance section. And so we'll read that for 10 minutes and give feedback for 20 minutes and move on. And I think one of the reasons why this works is there's no homework. It helps break the grant writing process into manageable chunks, and you get incremental feedback from smart people. And so for the grant writing groups that I have been involved with, we've had 7 out of 7 funded career development awards and 5 out of 6 funded R01. So I think the grant writing groups really, really help. And I actually have a document that I can circulate with how to start your own grant writing group. All right, so the takeaway points. 1 is strategy. Apply to places that might actually fund your work. So that might be outside of NIH, or it might be other institutes within NIH. Salesmanship, increase the significance and decrease the jargon. Formatting, make it easy to navigate and beautiful. And finally, make time for grant writing. Funding is really important at UCSF, so use your best brain for grant writing. I want to close with this quotation from Beverly Daniel Tatum. I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway at the airport. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt still moves the bystander along to the same direct destination as those who are actively walking. Unless we are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they'll find themselves carried along with the others. And so I bring this up at the close of a grant writing talk because many of us are actively under attack by our elected officials at the local, state, and federal levels. They are passing cruel and heinous policies that have real harms for individuals and societies. It can be overwhelming and unclear how to fight back, but we are researchers. We are knowledge producers. Doing good research and producing good knowledge is how we fight back. I assume that you are at UCSF for the same reason that I am, which is that we have a history of bold and progressive research that challenges the status quo. And so this talk is really a call to action while also acknowledging that it's easier to do good and rigorous research when it's funded. So I hope that after this talk, you now both have some tools to understand the enormity of the challenge ahead and a strategy to start to get your disruptive ideas funded. Thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
We have a couple minutes for questions. Folks want to put them in the chat or raise their hands.
Thank you
Anusha,
so
that was, yeah. Go ahead, Ellen.
No problem. Go ahead. I was just saying, thank you so much. That was super